Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be making a utility waist bag. And this bag measures in at 10 by 7 with a 5-inch depth. And if you're including the flaps, it measures in at 18.5 inches. We'll be adding 2 pockets, one up front that's a little bit smaller, and a large back pocket. Within the large pocket, we'll have an inside pocket. On the outside of the bag, we're going to be adding straps, and this helps kind of secure all the pockets together if you're packing a lot of stuff, and elastic loops up front. And if you're nervous about making this bag that it might look a little bit too hard, it's not. It's on the easier side. I'm going to walk you through step by step and really break down how to make this bag. So if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem. With all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna need 1 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using something heavier like canvas, denim, or twill. These are all great fabrics, they're durable, and they're very easy to work with. And I'm actually gonna be using a mix of canvas and nylon, so feel free to mix it up and really get creative with it. You'll need a 1/2 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be your lining on the inside of the bag. And I recommend something lighter weight, because once you start stacking layers together, it can get pretty bulky and it's harder to sew. I'm actually gonna be doubling up and using the same nylon I'm using for my main fabric. It's a nice, thin, durable fabric, and it works great for the lining. But always feel free to use whatever fabric you want that's gonna pull out the design you're going for. You'll need 3 zippers, and all these zippers have to be at least 15 inches. I'm gonna be cutting mine off of a roll. I found this is the best way to do it to save material and also money on zippers. It's a great way to go if you're making a lot of bags, because we don't actually need an exact size zipper for this bag. We're gonna be going past just a little bit and trimming the ends. You'll need 1 yard of 1-inch webbing and 2 yards of 1.5-inch webbing. This bag has 2 different size webbings. The 1-inch is for the up front, and the 1.5-inch is for the main strap. Going along with that 1-inch webbing, you're gonna need 2 strap adjusters, and these also have to be 1-inch strap adjusters. And going along with that 1.5-inch webbing, you're gonna need 1 buckle and 1 strap slider. And again, you want both of these to be 1.5-inch width to match your 1.5-inch width webbing. And for the optional features, we're gonna be adding the elastic loops up front. If you choose to do this, you're gonna need 1 yard of elastic, and you can pretty much pick any size elastic you want, and you'll need 1 cord stopper. I'm gonna be using a combination of a cord stopper and hooks. The hooks are super useful. You put them on the ends of the elastic, and it makes for a more useful tool. Again, this is optional, so if you choose to skip this step, you don't need these supplies. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super simple to use. All you have to do is print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. From here, we're gonna cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting, you should end up with 2 front pocket zipper side panels. Cut on the fold out of your main fabric, and I'm going to be using the nylon for this. I'm using this fabric for my secondary fabric and my main fabric. 1 front pocket bottom side panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. 1 front pocket cover lining panel cut out of your secondary fabric. 1 main pocket back zipper panel cut out of your main fabric. 1 main pocket front zipper panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. 1 main pocket bottom panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. 1 main pocket divider panel cut out of your secondary fabric. 4 front pocket cover top panels cut out of your main fabric. 1 front pocket cover middle panel cut out of your main fabric. 1 main pocket inside pocket bottom panel cut out of your secondary fabric. 1 main pocket inside pocket top panel cut out of your secondary fabric. 4 main side panels cut out of your main fabric. And lastly, 1 main pocket back panel cut out of your main fabric. Moving on to construction, we're going to start by grabbing our front pocket cover middle panel and chalking out the elastic loop marks. This step is optional, so if you're not adding the elastic, you can skip ahead. We're going to be adding the loops at the top and bottom of the panel, so you want these to line up perfectly. So you have a few different options for the loops. We're going to be using a leather strip, and we're going to cut it down into smaller strips to add on the top and bottom of our panel. You can also use webbing or anything that's going to create a loop and hold the elastic. After cutting the 2-inch strips, we're going to fold them in half to create the loop. Do the same thing if you're using webbing, and we're going to place these at the top and bottom of the panel with about a 1/4 inch hanging off the edge. And it's always best to test it and feed your elastic through to make sure your loop is big enough. This can change based on the size elastic you're using. We're going to take it one step further and add small D-rings at the end of the loop. This is not needed, but it's just an extra detail to really bring that bag together. Feed your strip through the D-ring, and these are 1/2-inch D-rings, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to pull the elastic through the D-ring. And again, either method works. It's totally up to you and the look you're going for. After picking your method, we're going to lay them out evenly across the top. From here, we're going to grab our front pocket cover top panels, and just to demonstrate what we're doing, we're going to place the right side of the top panel to the wrong side of the middle panel, and the right side of another top panel to the right side of the middle panel. So repeat those steps, including the loops. We're sandwiching everything in between those top panels, lining up the back flat edge. Once you have everything lined up and pinned down, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both top and bottom edge. It's super hard to pin the leather, so what I'm doing is adding the loops as I'm sewing. I found this was the easiest way to keep everything lined up. Double check the front and the back, and fold the top panels up so the wrong sides are together. When you have them lined up, the best thing to do is add a couple pins so they stay together. The goal is to line up the seam on front and back so we can add a top stitch. I'm going to be using an edge presser foot. This is a great tool to have for nice, straight, even top stitches, and it keeps it consistent throughout the bag. With the cover top panels lined up, we're going to add a top stitch directly on top of the seam allowance. Repeat this process for the opposite side, and just be careful if you are using leather to not break a needle when you're going over it. And that's going to complete our front cover panel. It's always good to test and run the elastic through it to make sure everything lines up, but we're going to be adding the elastic later to keep it out of the way, so place it off to the side and grab your front pocket zipper side panels. With the right sides facing up, find the zipper edge on both of the panels. Grab your 15-inch zipper, and mine's a little bit longer than 15-inch. I cut mine off of a roll because we're actually going to be trimming the ends, so you can go longer than 15. Place the right side of your zipper on the zipper edge of one of your panels, and the opposite panel on the opposite side with right side to wrong side. Sandwiching the zipper in between both of the panels on the zipper edge. With both of the panels lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Feel free to use a zipper presser foot if that works best for you. Double check both sides and flip the panels up so the wrong sides are together. Add a few pins just like we did in previous steps. With both sides perfectly lined up, add a top stitch directly on top of the seam allowance. And it's super important to make sure all of the edges line up on both of the panels. When you're satisfied with the stitch, we're going to grab our front pocket bottom side panel, unfold it and point the right sides up. Find the front edge. That front edge is going to line up with the zipper. Before we line the panels up, make sure your zipper train is moved to the inside of the panel. With the zipper train moved, we're going to place the right sides together, lining the zipper up with the front edge of the bottom side panel. The zipper panel is a tad shorter, so pin one edge and pull it to the opposite side and pin the other. With both sides pinned, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing the stitch, if you used a longer zipper, trim it flush with the seam allowance. Check and see if all the edges line up. If they do, we're going to be moving on and adding bias tape to the inside raw edges. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags. All these methods are great, so use whatever one that works best for you. After adding the bias tape, or if you chose not to, it's totally fine. You don't have to add the bias tape. We're going to be top stitching, so fold the seam allowance towards the bottom panel and stitch directly on top of the seam allowance. It can get pretty bulky going over the zipper, so just take your time. Place this panel off to the side and grab your front pocket cover lining panel. Along with the lining panel, you're going to need your complete cover panel. Place the wrong sides together, lining up the outside edge. We're going to be serging both of these panels together. You can skip this step, but overall it's going to make it easier when we start assembling the bag later on. And if you don't have a serger, a straight stitch works just fine. And it doesn't have to be perfect, we're just trying to consolidate it down to one panel. Grab your complete front pocket zipper panel, mark out the centers on the front and the back. Do the same for the complete cover panel. With all of the centers marked, we're going to line up the zipper with the top of the cover panel. in the center of the bottom with the center of the bottom side panel. Place a couple pins to keep it from moving around, and we're going to be adding a stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You definitely want to take your time with this stitch. Make sure both sides are getting pulled evenly through your machine. And like always, after finishing up the stitch, double check, make sure all the layers got stitched together. Pop the right side out, check the right side, do the same thing. If everything is looking good and all the layers are stitched, we're going to add double fold bias tape to that inside raw edge. And another reason why I added the serge is because you can actually swap out the serge for the bias tape. It's not going to be the same thing, but it will help prevent fraying. The bias tape does provide extra strength and gives an overall more professional feel. If you do plan on selling these bags, I highly recommend investing in a bias tape attachment. Anyways, moving on, grab your main pocket divider panel, mark the center on the top and bottom edge, do the same thing for the outside edge of our complete front pocket, place the right side of the divider to the wrong side of the front pocket. Add some pins to prevent any movement, and just like the previous step, we're going to stitch all the way around that outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure the fabric is moving evenly through your machine. After stitching, check the outside edge. See if the centers are still lined up. If so, place this panel off to the side and grab your main pocket back and front zipper panels. With the right sides facing up, find the zipper edge. Grab your other 15-inch or longer zipper. And again, we're going to be trimming the ends. Mark the centers on both of your panels. We want the centers to be perfectly lined up in the end. Starting with the back panel, we're going to place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, fold the panel up and add a few pins. Grab the main pocket front zipper panel, make sure you find that zipper edge, and we're going to place it on the opposite side of the zipper, lining up the center points. With the centers perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And before we move on, we're actually going to be covering up those raw edges on the inside with double fold bias tape. And this is just a great way to cover up any raw edge. It gives you just a little extra strength for heavy use. Flatten out both of the panels so the seam allowance is pointing away from the zipper, and we're going to add a top stitch to both sides of that zipper. And always feel free to add more than one top stitch for a double needle look. We're not going to snip the zipper ends just yet, so place it off to the side and grab our main pocket bottom panel. Chalk out the strap placement on both sides of the panel. Grab both of your 1-inch strap adjusters. Cut 2 5-inch strips out of your 1-inch webbing. This webbing should be the same width as your strap adjusters. Feed the webbing through the strap adjuster through the opening on the opposite end of the tab. Pull the webbing so it's equal parts on both sides. And lastly, place the webbing and strap adjusters on your marked areas. You'll want at least a 1/2 inch sticking off the edge. And stitch as close as you can to the edge. And you can stitch closer, you can also stitch a box or an X. This will give you less movement and flopping around. Grab the complete zipper panel from the previous step, find the front edge on the front panel, and the front edge on the side panel. It's going to be the same edge we placed the strap adjusters on. Just like we did our front pocket, we're going to line those two edges up with right sides together. Make sure you move the zipper train towards the inside of the panels. The zipper panel section is shorter, so we're going to pin one side and move it to the opposite side. With both sides lined up and pinned down, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, if you use a longer zipper, snip the ends flush with the seam allowance. Next, we're going to add our double fold bias tape to the raw inside edges. With the bias tape added, or if you chose not to add it, we're going to fold the seam allowance towards the bottom side panel and add a top stitch. And just be careful going over the zipper, it can get pretty bulky. After finishing up the top stitch, we can place this panel off to the side and grab our complete front pocket. Mark the centers on both top and bottom. The same for our complete main pocket side panel. Find the front edge, and that's the edge we're going to line up with the back edge of our front pocket. Flip the wrong sides out and place the right sides together, lining up the centers on both top and bottom edges. Place a few pins to keep everything from moving around. Once you have it pinned down and lined up, we're going to stitch all the way around that outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Keep all the layers moving through your machine evenly to prevent misalignment. Also take your time going over the webbing. After finishing up your stitch, double check to make sure all the layers got sewn together. Before we add our double fold bias tape, we're going to snip the webbing flush with the seam allowance. From here, we can add our bias tape. With the bias tape on, flip the right sides out and you can kind of start to see the bag coming together. Place it off to the side and grab our main pocket inside bottom pocket panel and our main pocket inside top pocket panel. Find the zipper edge on both panels, grab your last 15-inch zipper, Starting with the top panel, we're going to place the right sides together on the top portion of our zipper and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, fold it flat with right sides pointing up, add a couple pins, grab the bottom panel, place it on the opposite side of the zipper with right sides together, lining up the outside edges, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. With this panel, we will not be adding bias tape. We want this panel to be flat as possible, so we're going to move right into top stitching. Add a top stitch to both sides directly on the seam allowance. If you are using a fabric that frays a lot, I recommend adding a zigzag stitch or serging the edge before adding the zipper. Grab your main pocket back panel, mark the centers on the top and bottom edge, flip the wrong side so it's pointing up, and place our complete inside pocket on top with wrong sides together. We won't be serging these layers together. Instead, we're going to be adding a couple pins. This is going to keep everything aligned, making it easier to sew. Next, grab your pocket section and we're going to do it just like we did the divider. Place the right side of the inside pocket to the wrong side of the side panel. Add a few pins, making sure the centers are lined up, and we're going to stitch all the way around that outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance and try to get as close as you can to those corners. It's very key to keep all the edges lined up as you're sewing. Double check all the corners and edges and place this panel off to the side. Cut 2 half-yard strips out of your 1.5 inch webbing. Grab the complete pocket and we're going to be placing the webbing on the side edges. It's best to reference your side panel to make sure it lines up in the center of the outside edge. Once you've found where that spot is on your bag, pin it into position. Make sure the webbing is hanging off the edge about a 1/4 inch and stitch as close as you can to the edge. Grab all of your main side panels. We're going to be sandwiching the side edges just like we did the front pocket zipper with right sides together. Make sure the side panels are lined up with each other on both sides. With everything lined up and pinned down, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It can be very bulky, so take your time. After stitching, flip out the main side panels so the wrong sides are together. Place a few pins to avoid any misalignment. The seam allowance pointing towards the outside, we're going to add a top stitch directly on top of the main side panel. Just take your time, and I highly recommend picking a thread that matches the color of your side panels. Fold out your straps to make sure they still line up. If they don't, you can always go back and move them around to make sure they're perfectly lined up in the center of the main side panels. Also, if something went wrong along the way and the side panels are not lining up, you can always trim all the outside edges flush to avoid remaking the entire bag. This is just a quick fix to human or machine error, but if you've done everything correctly, everything should line up. And the reason we want all the edges to line up is because we're going to be adding double fold bias tape all the way around that outside edge. It's way easier to add when all the edges line up. This is a big design factor of this bag, so just take your time. And after stitching, just double check, make sure all the layers got sewn together. If everything is looking good, we can pull the straps out, place them flat on our main side panels. There's a few different ways we can stitch these down. We're going to be doing a standard box stitch and trying to get that stitch as close as we can to the outside edge. Also, matching the thread to your webbing really helps hide any imperfections. And always feel free to add more stitches to really secure that strap down. You could add another box or even an X stitch. Anyways, place the bag off to the side and cut 2 12-inch strips out of your 1-inch webbing. You can play around with the length of these. I recommend going 12-inch to start. You can always trim them down after we sew them on. Roll one edge over and place it directly over top of our 1.5-inch webbing. I like to line it up with the inside edge of the bias tape. Just like the strap, we're going to add a box stitch around the outside edge. Repeat this process for the opposite side, making sure both sides line up. From here, find the opposite side of the strap and feed it through your adjuster from the inside opening to the outside opening. Pull the webbing end out a couple inches, just enough so you can take that end, roll it over twice, and add a stitch. If you are using a nylon-based webbing, I recommend using a lighter to seal off the ends. Folding it double like this will help hide the raw edge, but also keep it from pulling back through the strap adjuster. Repeat the same process for the opposite side, and you can kind of see how the straps work, so you can take them in more if you want, or make them bigger with future bags. Moving on, grab your elastic, and I'm using about a 1/2 yard. I recommend using at least a 1/2 yard to start, and it's just like lacing up a shoe. Start on one side, feed it back and forth to the opposite side. Once you reach the opposite side, you have a few different options. We're going to start by adding a cord stopper. Depending on the size of your elastic, you should be able to feed both sides through your cord stopper. This is the first technique. The second technique is adding hooks. These go on the elastic ends, and they're very simple to add. Just add the ring over the elastic and clip the hook into the ring. I like to add these, it just adds another feature to that useful elastic, and I feel the best thing to do is just add both a cord stopper and hooks. Moving into the last step, we're going to add our buckle. Grab one of the webbing ends, it doesn't matter which side you use, feed the webbing end through the slider, and push the slider down the strap about a foot. With the slider on, grab your buckle, feed it through the outside opening, back down through the inside opening, pull a good amount of that webbing end out, and we're going to feed it back through the slider, so give yourself a little slack within the slider, feed it through the inside opening back to the outside opening. Pull the end out about 4 inches, and stitch it down to the side that went up through the slider, forming a loop. This will give you a lot of room to play around with. Moving to the opposite strap, feed the end through the other side of the buckle from the outside opening back down through the inside opening. This end we are going to roll over so we have a nice clean edge. And just like that, our strap is complete with a nice solid buckle. And like always, the final step is adding your branding. I always add mine in areas I can clip additional things to. And there you have it, your utility waist bag is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. It means so much. And if your bag didn't turn out great the first time, it really takes practice perfecting bags like this. More than likely, it's something with the machine you're using, the way the pattern was printed, or even the fabric you're using. And the most common issue is actually with the presser foot. If you have your presser foot set with way too much pressure, it's gonna actually push down too hard and so uneven. One side of the fabric will be going through on the feed dogs and the top will actually be getting pushed back with too much pressure. And this is a super easy fix. Just loosen up the pressure and you should be good to go. And when it comes to printing, if your printer is not aligned, the pages are gonna be tilted a little bit, and when you actually cut those, it's gonna have a tilt all the way through, and that's gonna throw the entire pattern off. And this is a super simple fix. Most of the time you can do this in a couple seconds, but I recommend looking up the brand you're using to find the correct method. And lastly, with the fabric can actually really throw off a pattern. If you're using a crazy thick fabric, you're gonna have to adjust the seam allowances just a little bit. But other than that, see what happened, where it went wrong in your bag. If it did go wrong, if it went right the first try, that's awesome. And just try to adjust it to get that perfect looking bag. But anyways, other than that, again, thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.